I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for her moving words, or moving tribute to Jim Oberstar. We both had the honor of speaking today at his funeral. We were both honored by his wife, Jean, and by his family. Jim served the 8th District for 36 years as their representative. He served it for 11 years before that, Senator Klobuchar said, as a staffer here on the Hill. And as she said, he died last weekend in his sleep. And I think Amy told me, Senator Klobuchar told me, that the family said that he wasn't 99%, he was 100%. So this came as a shock to all of us who knew Jim, and obviously deeply saddened us all. I announced for the U.S. Senate in February of 2007, and a few days later, I had my first public event where I took questions from folks. And this was at a coffee shop in St. James, Minnesota, in the southwest corner of our state, in the first district. The first question I got was from a woman asking if I believed there should be term limits. And from the way she asked it, I knew she thought there should be term limits. And I thought, great, my very first question, and I don't agree with the person who's asking it. So I said, no, I don't believe in term limits, and let me tell you why. Jim Oberstar. Jim has been congressman from the 8th District for 33 years now, and he's chairman of the House Transportation Committee, and he knows more about transportation than anybody else in the country. And everybody in the coffee shop, including the woman, kind of went, yeah, they nodded. They went, yeah, that makes sense. Jim was a walking advertisement against term limits. He was the consummate public servant, and it was all because he was a man who sought knowledge. He had a fierce curiosity about the world and an intense need to understand how things worked, all that enabled him to accomplish so much. If Jim were here today, if he had one more chance to speak to all of us, first he would say how much he loved his family and his friends and the people who work for him. Then he would tell us the history of American infrastructure, starting with the Erie Canal and how it opened up Midwestern agriculture to Europe, because he would explain it was 97% more efficient to ship those goods over water and down the Hudson and over to Europe than before. And he'd tell us how the Erie Canal made New York Harbor, New York City, made it what it is today. And then he'd take us through the Transcontinental Railroad and rural electrification and the interstate highway system, and all the way to rural broadband. Then he'd just go back to the Roman aqueducts, which were built by slave labor, and make an impassioned speech about the history of the labor movement. Jim sometimes had a tendency to go too long, but it was because he believed that everyone was as curious about the world as he was, and he was almost always wrong about that. I once had the opportunity to speak before Jim at the naming ceremony for the James Oberstar Riverfront Complex, the headquarters for the Voyageur National Park in northern Minnesota. So, since I was speaking before him, I took the opportunity to predict what Jim would talk about. I said he would talk about he'd tell us the legislative history of Voyageur National Park. He'd tell us about all the different streams of funding for the park. He'd tell us the history of the French voyageurs, the first white men in Minnesota. and that during part of the speech, Jim would speak in startlingly fluent French. Everyone laughed, including Jim, but that didn't stop Jim from telling us the legislative history of the park, all the different funding streams, and all about the voyageurs, and that part in French, and in delighting in every word of it. The first time I ever saw him chair, I went over to the House to see him chair a committee, was on high-speed rail. And he had witnesses from China and Japan and France and some other European country. And when it got time for him to do his questioning, I learned that Jim had piloted every one of those high-speed rail systems. And of course, when he questioned the French witness, he did it in French. And it was a tour de force, which I believe is French. Jim understood the importance of infrastructure to our economy, to economic development, and, as Amy was saying, for recreation. His legacy will be in the ports and locks and dams and highways and bridges and water systems throughout our country, but it'll also be in the bike paths in Minnesota and around the country. Jim was an avid bike rider. And he used to say that he wanted to turn our transportation system, the fuel, from hydrocarbons to carbohydrates. Jim will leave a legacy. And as I said, it all came from Jim's thirst for knowledge. And the pages are here. And I would urge you to thirst for knowledge, not just information. Some people in this town, or in other places too, just look for enough information to achieve some short-term goal. Jim sought knowledge, understanding of how things work. And because of that, he was able to get things done and was respected by all of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Amy and I were both there for the day that colleagues in the House paid tribute to him, and it was both sides of the aisle equally. We had a retirement tribute for Jim in Duluth in 2011, and Don Ness, the mayor of Duluth, about whom Amy spoke briefly, and who was at the service today, told a story at that tribute which says everything about Jim as a guy. Don was 23 years old, and he had been just hired to be Jim's campaign manager. And this was his first thing to do with him, was the 4th of July parades. Now, the 4th of July parades on the Iron Range are a big deal. There's a lot of them. There were 6 of these in 24 hours. And this was his big chance to impress his new boss. And he screwed up every bit of it. First thing he did was he was so obsessed with making arrangements that he forgot to make his own hotel reservation on the range. Don lived in Duluth. So he drove around the range to get a room until 1:30 in the morning, and he found one in Virginia, Minnesota. And so he overslept and had to drive to Chisholm, and he was late. So he picked up Jim, and he decided to make up the time, he just drove fast, and of course, he got pulled over and got a ticket, which made them really late for this parade, and they got put at the end behind the horses on a very, very hot, sweltering day. So all during the day, Donnie just makes one screw up after another. He offended a local TFL activist. He lost Jim for about a half an hour, Jim knew where he was, but he didn't know where Jim was. And he left this black car parked directly in the sun during a parade, and it just became, you know what that means. So then, thankfully, after the 5th parade, there was going to be like a 3-hour break. And they were going to drive to somebody's house where they would be able to eat and get in the air conditioning and relax. And so Donnie decided to put the signs in the trunk. And as he was doing it, as he was closing it, he saw the keys in the car, locked in the car. And it took them 90 minutes to find someone who could open the car, and they lost their break. Now, he was a 23-year-old kid, and he was certain that he was going to be fired. He felt he deserved to be fired. Now, Jim had been calm with him all day, had been nice to him all day, but he just figured that Jim was stuck with him to the end of the day, and at the end of the day, he'd fire him. So he drives Jim home to Chisholm. It's 9 at night now, and they get out of the car, and he starts to apologize, and said, I just blew it today. I know this was my chance, and I've blown it, and I'll never be in public service. This guy's now, what term is he in, Amy? 3rd? Yeah, 3rd term as mayor of Duluth. What did he get, 87% or something like that? And Jim stopped him. Wouldn't let him finish. Stopped him. And he said, I'm really proud of you. You've had a tough day. We had a tough day. You had a lot of adversity. You had a lot of things to overcome, and you never lost your head, which was really not true. Donnie was panicking the entire time. That's probably why Donnie made those mistakes. And then he gave Don a big hug. That big Jim bear hug that so many people talked about today. So then Don carried a bag for Jim, and Jim one too, up to the front porch, and Jim said before Don went back to the car, he said, I'm proud of you. Don't worry about today, I'm proud of you. Don went back to the car, got in the car, and his head was swimming with, he couldn't believe the kindness, the warmth. And then as he started to back out, he looked back, and Jim was still on the porch. I gave him this big wave. Said, Happy Independence Day. Minnesota lost a giant. The United States lost a giant today, or this week. But we also lost a good guy. He was a great guy, a great man, and a good guy. Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.